Okay. Hi, this is Nicole. I guess I start now saying hello to everybody that's out there watching us on YouTube and following us at National during National Digital Inclusion Month. Let's say hello to everybody who's up on line wave, so they all know that we're here and we're alive and we're ready to get started with this next conversation. I'm Nicole Turner-Lee. I'm a fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and very happy to participate in this conversation. This is an issue that is near and dear to my heart. We must do something about the digital divide. And I think all of us that are watching today understand that if we don't solve this problem of the underconnected and the disconnected, we are doing a disservice to them for a variety of reasons, in which you'll hear from this panel today. So today's panel, because I want us to jump right in and have a lot of conversation, I'm going to just put a disclaimer out there. If I mess up during this video, it's not my fault, because I don't know what I'm doing right now. But I want you to actually know that the panelists know what they're doing when it comes to the conversation. I may not know what I'm doing as far as technical. Today, the panel session is entitled, Why Bother? Understanding Digital Divides and the High Stake Gambles of Inaction. And we're joined today by some very esteemed folks that are out there working in the community or working in their own respective communities to get stuff done at the federal, the national, and the local level. I'm going to ask them just to raise their hand as I introduce them, so that way you know who they are. Claude Aiken is the legal advisor to FCC Commissioner Clyburn at the Federal Communications Commission, where he serves as the Associate General Counsel and Special Advisor on Internet Law and Policy. He's held a variety of positions at the commission and very well able to speak on this topic today. Jim, who you don't see, is the president of Inclusive Technologies, and he's been working in the field of technology and disability for 25 years. I've known his work for a while, and he's actually worked to really ensure that when we talk about digital inclusion, that we're including all people of all abilities in this mix. Next to him is Parisa Fatahi Weeks, who's the head of community impact programs and investments for Google Fiber. In that role, she's responsible for developing and delivering a range of social impact investments and community engagement strategies in Google Fiber cities. And Parisa, I'm not gonna tell you how old I am, but I remember when Google Fiber was bidding those projects, just to give you a sense of how much history I have there. And Roberto Gallardo, somebody who I've spoken to on the phone, I finally get to meet. Yes, he is in probably the most relaxed location than the rest of us there in the state of Mississippi. He's the Associate Extension Professor at Mississippi State University Extension Services, a fellow PhD who's worked with rural communities over the past 10 years, conducting local and regional community economic development practices. So thank you, panelists, for participating. I'm gonna start over, Claude, all the way over to you, because I can see you, okay? And I'm gonna start with this question that I want all of the panelists to basically answer, which is, why should we care about this persistent digital divide? Why are we still talking about it, and why should we still care about it?
Well, thanks, Nicole, and thanks everyone for joining me on this esteemed panel. Happy Digital Inclusion Week, Digital Inclusion Month. So happy to be here and be able to talk about this important topic with everybody. Just put simply, I think it's important because connectivity is empowerment. If you are connected, then you have an easier time applying for jobs, doing your homework, interacting with government. Your life is easier if you are connected. And that is why working towards connectivity for all is so important. A couple of things that the FCC does in that space are the E-rate and Lifeline program. The E-rate program is designed to provide subsidies to schools and libraries to further connectivity at those places. And as you know, that some of these locations are are folks who are at the front lines of digital inclusion efforts. So that's a way that the FCC supports them. The Lifeline program is a means-tested subsidy for connectivity, for voice and broadband services. It's a $9.25 discount that folks who are able to apply for certain means-tested programs can get, and those are a couple things that the FCC is working on and is doing on the digital inclusion front. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you very much. Parisa, we'll go right over to you then in terms of asking the same question. Why should we care about this issue? Why are we still talking about this issue?
Sure, and thanks for posing it, Nicole. So my background happens to be as a civil rights attorney working on issues of access to affordable housing, access to public transit, especially in increasingly gentrifying urban areas. And at that time, the reason I was working on those issues is because the affordable housing and access to public transit are critical to building blocks to opportunity, to climbing that ladder of economic, social mobility. And when this opportunity came up to be in a startup that was trying to really disrupt the industry and how we provide internet, I saw access to the internet and the other aspects of digital inclusion as equally important building blocks of opportunity. In fact, we all know these statistics, but what paints the picture very clearly that this issue is front and center are the most commonly cited data points I hear are that 80% of Fortune 500 jobs, you have to go online to apply for them. So if you want to apply for that job at Walmart, you need to be able to go online. And between 75 to 80% of teachers, that homework gap, they assign homework that requires internet access, but that is not how many students have access. So really this divide, if you're on the wrong side of it, you're falling farther and farther behind, and you're facing some of the other most persistent challenges our society faces along racial and other socioeconomic lines. And so I think that's why this issue is absolutely critical.
And you're so right. I mean, Pew's research over the summer said that 13% of Americans right now aren't connected, right? And that 13% of Americans really adds up, folks. And when we talk about who's in that bucket, and Roberto, I'm going to toss it over to you and then I'll go to Jim, they're predominantly low-income people, people with limited education, disproportionately people of color, people who live in rural. So Roberto, when we look at those statistics, following up with the previous panelists, again, why is this still here? Is it society? Is it the people? Is it something else?
Thank you, Nicole. I think it is. I'm going to echo what my colleagues have said earlier. It's something that's very, very important to continue working towards. I'm right now in the very rural Mississippi County. We're trying to get folks trained to work from home, but their connectivity speeds are not up to speed. And that is just so frustrating, being that it's 2017. And so I think that, yes, those that are on the wrong side of the divide will be left further and further behind, like Parisa was saying. And I think that it's critical for us to make sure that people understand, policymakers and community leaders, especially in rural communities, that this is something that is needed. It needs to be bridged. It needs to be worked on because, in rural communities, young people leave and elderly people leave. And I think broadband can really unite those two generations.
And if you're following this conversation, I'd be beyond me to not tell you to tweet this conversation, folks. # digital inclusion. So please tweet this conversation, # digital inclusion. Roberto, thank you for those comments. Jim, I'm going to have you jump in here so we hear from everybody. The community who are, I kind of say the people who, are more fortunate than many of us to actually realize their sensitivities to things that are around us. The disability community continues to be persistently behind when it comes to the digital divide. What's happening, Jim, too, that is really not correcting or self-correcting this issue in this community as well?
Well, thank you, Nicole. I think you're right. I think there are, among all of the jeopardized populations that are out there, and we can recite the list. It's certainly rural. It's also urban. It's people of color, people with low income, people with low educational attainment. small social networks, and people with disabilities, or people who have a usability challenge, or even just the perception of a usability challenge. And that's an awful lot of people. I think if you look at that last 15, 20, 25% who are not online at all, or not fully online, there's a lot of question marks that are sitting over their head saying, can I do this? I feel awkward. Maybe I can't really participate here. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe it won't work for me, and maybe I'll be embarrassed. There's a whole constellation of factors, some of which are just perceptions, that are keeping people offline. On the benefit, the why bother, there's the equity issue, and there's the participation issue, which people have mentioned, and I think launched into that discussion really well. I have nothing to add there. I would look at the other side of the equation a bit and say, what is the benefit to the rest of society, people who are already online? And I'll give you an example from my local school district. I live in a very really typical middle class, working class community here in New Jersey. And in our school district, over the last 5 years, we've been trying to go to what I call digital completion, where everybody's online. So every student has access at home, and every parent can reach the teacher, and vice versa. And we're not quite there. Because we're not quite there, there's an awful lot of additional work that has to happen. We're still handing out printed pamphlets about events. We're still getting written forms from parents saying that their student can participate in an activity. When we want to be all digital, we're not quite there. So for every person who's not online, there's a tax on the rest of us. And that's true in our personal lives as well. When we have to go and visit an elder relative, instead of talking with them over a video link like this, or where they can't go to a caregiver, and we have to take them instead of a consultation on email or over video. So there is this social tax of that last 15 or 20%, whatever the number is, and ending that exclusion, for whatever reason it's out there, is going to redound to social benefit, both in terms of money and in terms of productivity and satisfaction, inclusion, and social participation. So it's a really important issue to resolve.
No, I think that you're right on point. I'm going to open it up to the panel for a second question that sort of follows off on this. That social tax, right? It comes from being online as opposed to inline, right? And that's something that we used to say when I was a digital evangelist out working in communities, that, no longer will people be able to stand in line. They need to get online. And the further and further you're away from the digital economy, now the digital sharing economy, right? The less likely you're actually able to accrue many of the benefits that you talked about, Jim. I want to throw it out to the panelists, though. It's been over 15 years that we've been talking about the digital divide. In fact, if you all remember, we went from the divide to the digital inclusion, to digital inclusion and digital equity. And now we're sort of back at the digital divide, particularly here in Washington, D.C. What's blocking change? Or has there been progress that we need to sort of talk about that has only gotten so far with regards to addressing and solving this problem? I'll throw it out to anybody. Since I could see you, just raise your hand, and then that way I'll have you speak first. Okay, go ahead, Prisa. Sure.
Well, first I want to say, why I want to build on what Jim and you were just talking about what do the rest of us pay in terms of cost? And I think about elected officials who, if they want to make decisions that actually are right for the communities that policy is going to impact, they need all sectors of society to be ready to give input. And increasingly, input is being collected or submitted through technology. And if you increasingly only have one sector falling behind, then those impacts of the policies that they are looking to enact are going to have the reverse impact that they want to have. So we really need equal engagement. If you are a service provider, I think here in Austin, the Housing Authority, the provider of public housing here, a couple of years ago, if you want to get on the waiting list for public housing in Austin, you can only now do it online. You can't stand in line anymore, just like you said. And that is a population that actually tends to be most affected by the digital divide and are often on the wrong side. So these are all parts of that social tax you just described. And in terms of whether there has been progress worth celebrating or why it remains, I've been with Google Fiber since the early days of the business, over 3 years now. And the conversations in this new cities that we enter are now much more sophisticated and cross-functional, cross-sectional, coalition-led than they had been when we first started. Now, I'm in an exceptional city like Austin, where we've got local leaders that had forward vision and formed task forces, strategic plans, et cetera, early, but they used to be the exception. And now we're starting to see that movement for that kind of leadership locally happen more and more. And that's very heartening, because that is truly the only way we're going to cross this divide.
Claude, you want to add in something?
Sure, I'll add something in. So I think one of the big things that has happened from the FCC's perspective in the last year was the modernization of the Lifeline program that brought broadband into the equation. So previously, the supported service was voice, and given the recognition that we all live in a broadband world now, we brought broadband in and created a mechanism for folks who want to provide broadband, Lifeline broadband, to get into the program. There have been some difficulties with that in terms of implementation. We've been challenged in court on it, and the current chairman has brought back that process. But my boss believes that the program is the fundamentals are solid. We need more competition and more choice in Lifeline broadband, and we just need to get the word out. I mean, there are a huge number of people who are eligible to participate in it who do not take advantage of it. So leveraging the folks who are on this panel and who are listening into this presentation, like education about Lifeline and making Lifeline a part of the portfolio of services that you may offer to your constituents is an important step forward from here.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a critical key, Claude, right? Because when you look at the circles or the Venn diagram of the digital divide, it's often access, availability, and affordability, right? And so getting a program like Lifeline off the ground and extending that to broadband really enables what Marisa was talking about, this ability of people to be much more connected to society in which they actually work, live, learn, and earn. Roberto, over to you, and then I'm gonna go to Jim again. In a place like Mississippi, where the challenges are very great, it seems like with rural, we have this common theme of not enough access, not enough availability. The cost is still high. What is happening in Mississippi? And I know you run a great program out there. I'm so happy to finally see your face because I've read all about your work. But what's happening in Mississippi where there's maybe some glimpse of progress with regards to your efforts?
Sure. I focus mainly on the adoption side of the equation. I understand that access is critical, obviously, but many times access is there. It's just people don't really see the relevance of using that technology, or they're intimidated because of all they hear. So I start usually with education and awareness. On that front, as any community development process, it takes time. We're starting to see some movement, which is very interesting. On the access side, there is a regional carrier here that has deployed fiber to the home over the past 4 years. We have 3 or 4 communities in Mississippi that are fiber to the home. Other larger providers are also starting to deploy fiber to the premise. So it's very interesting. But then you get to the same an argument I get all the time. Well, I've upgraded the infrastructure. People are not subscribing. Why? Well, because I guess they feel what they have is sufficient. They're not willing to pay a little bit more, to get faster speed. So it's an education awareness issue as well. And I think we're moving the needle, but it will take time. Education and awareness is the first step. However, I've seen plans and strategies that just jump into with a lot of assumptions, and you never never take the time to backtrack a little bit and say, do those assumptions hold? So.
I mean, and Jim, this is actually relates to the disability community, right? A lot of products and services get made and they're not often designed for accessibility that you talked about earlier. When we look at, again, progress or limitation, where do you see us falling in terms of the disability community when it comes to digital inclusion?
Well, I would say that we turned a corner 5 years or so ago where the supply of accessible technologies for the internet and other technological arenas has really zoomed forward. I mean, it's really hard at this point to come up with a particular online function that can't be performed by a person with, almost any kind of disabilities. I'm not saying there aren't any residual problems, but as Roberto has said, the adoption side is such a key part of it, and I'm guided by the stories that I hear, what we refer to as technological pessimism. That is, somebody tried something 5 years ago or 2 years ago, and it didn't work out for them, and they're more reluctant to try something again. They've kind of given up on it. And then the other thing that guides me is the astonishing finding, I think it was from Pew, maybe 2-3 years ago, that did studies of people who are not on the internet, and they more than 70% of them said that it would take help getting online. So the message to the digital inclusion community, I think, has been, taken on board, that an arm's length approach is not going to work for those last adopters. They're going to need something that's within their social network, within their family, within their, their comfort, social comfort zone, to help them get online, help them and scaffold their skills up to the point where they're fully functional. So it's a social process more than a, purely technology. I get so frustrated when I see these facilities oriented, subsidies, tens of, hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars. And I'm sure it's necessary, but the amount on that social process, that learning, that adoption, that inclusion, that perception of self as fitting into the online world, it's pennies on that. And we really need to pay more attention to it.
Well, I mean, but you bring up a good point, and I'm going to pivot over to Claude for a second. I think we're moving in this next wave of digital divide towards more function oriented. So like you said, instead of looking at, are there pipes available? Competition obviously is still a very important factor in this whole conversation. So don't get me wrong. But we're seeing people like Commissioner Clyburn, Claude, right? Look at issues like telemedicine and telehealth to bring some value proposition. So the reason why this should be a larger problem and a larger concern than what is actually today. It's, back in the days, and I'm not going to date myself, for all of you that are looking out in Austin, I knew about the Austin Freenet when I was part of the Community Technology Center movement. So I'm so surprised that all of us are still here doing this work and having the same conversation. But Claude, tell us a little bit more about what Commissioner Clyburn is actually trying to do, at least to bring some alignment with the value proposition of broadband and the solving of social concerns, or the social tax that Jim has been talking about.
Right. So thanks, Nicole. You're absolutely right. She's been very interested in talking about not just broadband for the sake of broadband, but broadband and how it's used and how it can be leveraged to improve people's lives. So you talked about health. Telemedicine, particularly for folks in rural areas, can be a game changer in terms of the quality of life and the quality of care that they get. Some of the other folks have already talked about how connected education can really make a difference. I think it comes back to the point. The FCC, as part of its Lifeline reforms, actually came out with a digital inclusion report in January of this year. And one of the key recommendations, if you kind of boil it down, is to meet people where they are and talk about how connectivity can improve their lives and do things for them that are important to them. So, I mean, you're not going to talk about the benefits to to someone, you're not going to talk about the homework gap to someone who doesn't have kids. And so just meeting people where they are and, articulating benefits that are relevant to them as part of an education effort, I think is important.
And Marisa, that's what you guys did at Google, right? In terms of what you're doing in Austin now with public housing and affordable housing, reminiscent of my days at One Economy, where we thought about bringing it home, was a huge campaign that we ran just to make sure that there was connectivity. Again, I'm not dating myself. We were actually still using Ethernet cords, and then we just started using Wi-Fi. We've come a long way, folks, when it comes to technology, every time I think about it. But tell us a little bit more about, how Google became so vested in this initiative. And I want you to speak a little bit about, is there federal support for this type of stuff? A lot of the conversations that we have, this gamble comes in the title of this, from the top, right? And we've seen a lot of great grassroots up. What about from the top? How has Google been supported in their efforts?
I think one of the advantages we have as new entrants to the market, as a startup with that mentality of innovation, is we are able in different markets that we are in to make a gamble and try a new kind of partnership. And when you're in a city like Austin, which was one of the earliest cities that Google Fiber ventured into, we benefited from the incredible leadership and brilliance of community partners in the community and jumped in to join them and say, okay, we know it takes a village. We know no one actor, whether private or public sector, can solve this problem. How can we create an exemplary partnership with the Housing Authority, with service providers like Austin Freenet, Skill Point Alliance, Latinitas, you name it. Everyone's really come to the table now that doubles down on the idea that you can't only provide one leg of the stool. You have to, in addition to actually wiring a building where people live, you have to equally invest in digital literacy. And that's where a partner like Austin Freenet came in. And frankly, our team members, public housing residents had every reason to distrust us when we came in and said, we're going to sign you up for internet in your home and it's not going to cost you something. They had every reason to say, well, is that a trial period that's going to end and leave us with a very costly bill? And we had to relationship build and really show that we were in there for all three legs of the stool, including the refurbished devices. And so that three-legged stool approach, that partnership that built on strengths of various community actors, institutionally and nonprofit, really became the model for what is now the Connect Home program led by HUD, of course. And that's where I guess there is an example of the federal support coming in to create some models and evangelize it to other cities. So we are very excited to continue to be a part of that program.
Yuck, and we're hoping that that program and others will continue. I'll leave that right there. Roberto, coming over to you. I'm in DC, Claude's in DC. There's a different conversation going on in the Beltway than there are in local communities. And some would argue that some of the challenges that we've had with digital inclusion comes because we have no clue what real people are actually doing in the real world when they use technology. What are we missing in Washington, D.C. to actually have this very full conversation around, bridging the digital divide and advancing digital equity? People like you in Mississippi, what do we need to be talking about when it comes to policy?
That's a great comment and great question, Nicole. I love my job because I'm in the trenches. See, I'm not this academic guy in my silo, just thinking, solving everything. I think that the assumptions that I mentioned about that, many times we miss out on the education and awareness, which is critical. It's many times overlooked. I know from a federal level, it's really hard to customize something. It's typically they take a cookie cutter approach, and it really, again, puts rural at a disadvantage where, well, this works great here, here, here. We've got this great program, this great resource, but hey, I have a part-time mayor. How in the world do you expect us to complete all this, to get on board or whatever? So I think that just listening to partners like our own, like us and others throughout the country, that we are in the trenches, and the reality is different. Though I have noticed that rural does share similarities with urban. and not urban as a whole, but urban neighborhoods. And I've seen time and time again that specific urban neighborhoods have the same challenges than rural. So I would really ask for any federal program to really kind of test them in the urban neighborhoods, and more than likely they will be replicable in the rural environment.
See, I told you I was going to do something that was not going to be right. So for those of you that did not know what I was saying, I just turned off the mute. So if you have a question, because we've got one coming out of Austin that we're going to ask in just a moment, please send those questions. Tianka's there sitting with many of you. We want to hear your questions. And if you're on Twitter, send them through to Twitter and we'll definitely answer. Hashtag digital inclusion, digital inclusion week. Send those questions along, NDIA, etc. Jim, I want to just pick up with you just before we wrap on to some questions and a couple other general questions. Federal, local, state policies, are they connected or not connected when it comes to trying to address this issue?
Well, I guess I think of it at top down and bottom up. On the bottom up side, I'd love to see more focus in our digital inclusion programs in both the accessibility and usability of the training materials, and in fact, the whole process of getting online. How do you recruit people who have disabilities? How are we recruiting seniors in a way that comfortably attracts them? And then can we actually fit the courseware and the whole experience of learning to their expectations and their abilities and their preferences? So it's really kind of a customer focus. At the top down, one thing that I'm working on with a consortium of ICT companies, including Yahoo and Facebook and HP and Cisco and some federal agencies as well, is a better understanding of consumers with disabilities and seniors with disabilities as consumers, not as patients, not as residents in a nursing home, but as autonomous consumers who learn about products, who make decisions about products. How do they right now find out what works for them? Do they use peer information? Do they go to stores and try things out? What is that function? How does that look to them so that those companies can in fact be more friendly in offering their products to folks who are underutilizing those things now? So that's a federal, in fact, it's a somewhat of a global market research project that we hope to answer some of those, mysterious questions about how these consumers actually behave. And then that bottom up piece of making sure that everything's super friendly, super peer, appropriate, and that the trainers have some awareness training and they're not nervous about people with disabilities or seniors or what have you. It's a very important part of the, filling this gap.
No, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, as a sociologist, at Brookings, I'm always thinking about this whole model of consumption and production, right? And so what you're basically suggesting is getting the private sector to also look at these segmented populations that tend to be underconnected as not just, a problem that needs a solution to be solved, around whatever the marginalization is, but also thinking about their potential is really interesting, right? Because that means that we're looking at them in the way that most of society is looking at technology as a consumption area. I mean, there's other areas,
Exactly.
Parisa could actually talk to this, right? Where we want people to also produce. Go ahead, Jim.
You
go ahead.
You got it. You passed the test. The first time you heard it, you got it, and that I'm very, very glad. So, yeah, I think we're all in agreement that on the adoption side that we can't just be offering the same thing over and over again. To this last quartile of people are very different from the previous folks who adopted. There's less enthusiasm, there's less motivation, there's less of a lot of stuff. It looks distant to them, it looks foreign to them, and we have to do something about that. And I think that's generally understood. Some of us are, still looking around, well, what exactly do we do? But I think we understand it and we're moving in the right direction.
No, I totally agree. Now I want to get to a question, everybody. We've got Catherine Crago, who's from the Housing Authority of the City of Austin. Hi, Catherine, if you're watching us. Her question, and I want to throw it out to everybody: are there truly best practices for digital inclusion, or do cities have to find their own? Are there truly best practices for digital inclusion, or do cities have to find their own? So I'll throw it out to the first person who I see mute come off. And everybody, if you could be brief so we can get some more questions in, that'd be great. Going once, going twice. Go ahead, Roberto.
I think that there is no need to reinvent the wheel. Okay. However, every city is different. Every neighborhood is different. What I've adopted here in Mississippi is learn from others, and then of course tweak it and make the appropriate listening, meeting them where they need to be met. That makes a very effective program. Now, of course, I could go into more details, but the key thing would be that there's no need to reinvent the wheel, but do not just apply it as a cookie cutter approach. So my short answer is yes and no to that question. So
there's a toolkit, but not quite, right? Because everybody is different. Claude, or Parisa, or Jim?
Sure, I'll hop in. Just kind of a plug if folks are really, starting at square one and looking for some reading material. I would recommend the FCC's strategies for digital inclusion. One of our bureaus took a look at this issue and came up with a couple of best practices and some examples of some innovative things that folks are doing, including in Austin. So if you're looking for reading material and a place to start, it's a place that I know.
That's right. And that information on the FCC is still available. So I would go to that. And NTIA also had a toolkit that was available last year and should still be on the website. But I know they also had some broadband best practices. Parisa, you want to jump in?
I think both of my colleagues nailed it, Roberto and Claude, just that, of course, there are learnings. But most of those learnings have come from folks who have just taken a risk and tried something in their local market, in their community, found what worked, and now we just need to keep doing a great job of sharing those, just the way that folks have talked. But if it were totally easy and it was low hanging fruit, as Jim said, then that cookie cutter approach would have worked. But you do need to be willing to tailor in your communities, listen to your neighbors, to your family members, and use a little bit of ingenuity to make it personal.
Yeah, Jim, I'm going to go with the second question. I'll pivot it to you and then others join in. How can digital inclusion providers make the case to policymakers to fund digital inclusion strategies beyond broadband infrastructure? So how can digital inclusion providers make the case to policymakers to fund digital inclusion beyond broadband infrastructure? Good case in point, as this question points out, is BTOP. It was great, but then the funding dried up. So what needs to be done in that case to have some more redirected funding? Jim, I'll start with you.
Well, if you're talking about in comparison to the facilities support adoption, yeah. Well, I don't know how to say it kind of in non-political terms. So I'm not gonna mince words. I really think it is a failure of a recognition of where the barriers exist. I think John Horrigan, and it was several years ago, John Horrigan identified that, 92% of the people who don't have the internet yet have it available by more than one vendor in their community. So there are places where facilities are an issue, but adoption is the real issue. And I think it's almost a value calculation has to be done if we're going to rely on financial terms. What is the value to a merchant of having those extra 10%, 15% customers? What is the church membership, the voting, the family reunions? Everything has that value, and you can quantify it. And if it's an adoption issue, then whatever you spend up to that point to secure that additional adoption is a worthwhile investment. And we just have to translate our, almost philanthropic view with respect to adoption into, some sort of quantified terms, like a global development, right? This is a big issue about, the happiness index, and, how do we identify the satisfaction that people have with one system or another. And we need to move from the current viewpoint into this more subtle sociological appreciation of that, that multi-dimensional value, instead of just the kind of hard numbers and hard bandwidth numbers that we're, focused on.
So I want to give some context to that question, Roberto, and I'll come right to you, and maybe you could tag on with this. So the president is offering more money towards infrastructure, and it doesn't seem that there's a lot of money towards people. So Roberto, as you answer your question, I mean, are we at a quagmire right now in terms of this viewer's question, that we're going to see more and more resources given to the hard assets and less given to the soft assets? It doesn't necessarily mean if you build it, people will come.
Correct. And I'll answer that. But based on your previous question, public policy 101 is how you frame the issue, right? And I've seen in my case, policymakers understand jobs, and I just frame it as a workforce development issue. If you do not invest in people, you're missing out on the future workforce, the current workforce, and a lot of other issues. Now, about the focusing again on infrastructure, I think that it's a chicken and egg situation many times, because communities that understand the value of it want it, and they may not have it, and so they're stuck. And others may have it, but then they don't see the relevance, and so they don't utilize it to the highest degree. So it's really tricky. It's really complex. But again, if you sit down and listen to that community, if you engage with them, I think it becomes clear which approach to take. Ideally, it would be good to have a fund for digital inclusion adoption, just like we do infrastructure, right? Hey, go ahead and tap into this fund or this other fund, depending on the community's needs.
Yeah, I mean, it's been tough. I've been in this business for a long time, like many people who are watching, and going from program to program always requires additional resources. I mean, Claude, I'll just pivot over to you, because the FCC has been saying the concept of digital divide under Chairman Pai. And I know Commissioner Clyburn has been talking about digital equity for a very, very long time. Mm-hmm. Why do we keep reaching that stall point, though, when it comes to putting more money towards literacy and more money towards this or action-oriented or function-oriented use of the technology?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question. So, speaking narrowly and parochially for at the FCC, there's some, legal limitations that we have. We talk about, so I kind of see it in three buckets. You're talking about infrastructure, making sure that the infrastructure is out there. There is there's making sure that infrastructure is available in terms of price barriers to adoption, and then there's those tricky non-price barriers that other folks have been talking about, and it's those non-price barriers to adoption that that the FCC has not historically funded and focused financial resources on. We've done a lot through the Lifeline program on the price barriers to adoption, and I think the fact that there's still a significant chunk of people who are eligible but do not uptake or take up the service, shows how powerful that those non-price barriers are. But I think the work that folks are doing in the communities on that third bucket, those non-price barriers to adoption, are really going to be the ones that carry the day.
No, I agree with that. I'm going to pivot, and I have a question for Jim that's on people with disabilities. But while we're on this topic, I want to just go to a question that just came in from Nathan in Austin. How will the current administration's unpredictable nature, I didn't put in the word unpredictable, that's coming from Nathan. Nathan, if you're watching, I understand, affect digital inclusion where funding comes from? So how will the current administration's unpredictable nature affect digital inclusion and where funding comes from? Anybody want to take that on?
Yeah, this is Jim. I'll take it on. Okay. Well, rubber meets the road. I don't find this administration unpredictable at all in terms of digital inclusion. I find them directly and indirectly opposed to everything we've been trying to do for the last 20 years, honestly. What we see, and I don't want to embarrass anybody, and I'm not going to try to get a consensus here. What we see with respect to net neutrality, what we see with respect to internet privacy, what we see with respect to Lifeline, these are serious backward steps. I have no hope whatsoever for affirmative, positive motion from this administration. We're going to be in a defensive mode. We're going to be in a hunker down in your community and get things done, you know, by rubber band and paperclip mode for a good long while. You know, and that's the direct part of it. The indirect part is even more insidious and more dangerous. And that is, if I'm trying to make a case to somebody that they should get online, and they now have new worries about their income, they have new worries about healthcare, they have new worries about the education their children are getting, it's going to push digital inclusion, which we know should be a primary facilitator to all of that good stuff. But when you're in the middle of that storm with the four-letter word in front of it, you can't possibly focus your attention on it with those other factors coming at you so hard and fast. So both the direct assaults on digital inclusion and the indirect assaults on the most jeopardized people in society, this is not a time to mince words. It's a fight back time. It's a pushback time. We all have troubles doing that with inside the organizations we're in, but I really think we have to call upon, you know, our organizations and our own selves to recognize the situation that we're in and get things done the way they should be done.
Well, Parisa, this is a question to sort of follow up on what Jim is talking about, and you know, Nathan's comment about, you know, do we rely upon this administration? Clearly, because digital inclusion has always sort of been an outlier versus something that's more integrated into some of the general government budgets and federal budgets. Is this time for a social enterprise model? A comment from Lizone Graves out there in the universe has said, I think a social enterprise model should be explored beyond relying on public funds. That's how we should fund operations. Google is one of those premier companies on social enterprise development. Should we be looking at something like this to sort of solve some of the barriers that Jim is placing right now before us?
Yes, and count us in as continuing to be interested in partnering with the wisdom within local communities. And what we found is that sometimes we are able to shine a spotlight on an issue, and some of it is that we invest money, some of it is that we invest people power, but some of it is just the platform. And when you're able to shine a spotlight on the issue, you can sometimes attract competitors, which we're happy to do. We're happy when more competitors enter this important space. Sometimes you attract other sort of pillars of the community, other parts of the business community where we work, to come together to be a part of the table that looks at this solution. But it still comes back to what you opened us up with, Nicole, which is how do you package it and make the value proposition one that makes sense to that partner for why they should come to the table.
And Roberta, I want to ask you, I mean, are you going to sit back and wait for the government to give you money to continue the stuff that you're doing, or are you going to be creative to keep pushing the model and the work that you're doing in Mississippi? Like, how are you going to do this, man? You know, there's a lot of stuff going on. I want to know what you're going to do in Mississippi to keep those people served. Yes,
I'm always looking for funding, public, private, whatever it is that comes my way. But I've noticed that if I'm going to be preaching about these digital platforms and you know, the digital age and all that, I've come to see that it's relatively not that expensive for any community to start making this transition if they do indeed rely on these digital platforms. So in the end, it's not those many resources, because that's the question I get every time I go and present at a community: how much will this cost us? And the initial response is time and passion for your community. Because when you are really dedicated to finding a way, you will find a way. And it's relatively easier in this digital age with all the digital platforms out there to do that. Now, of course, you do need resources in the end, But I've found that message to be really quite interesting, where the communities realize, they go, oh, okay, so it won't cost us up front. No, let's go with this. That's a source of frustration. Your federal agencies are so, I would say, industrial age. Their grant process, it's really like, no, 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 no. We're trying to do something way different this time. Please, can you just listen to me? No, sorry, that boom. But here we are, still trying every day.
Yeah, I mean, it's something, and when we start wrapping up, I want to make sure I get this question in, because this is an area that often gets not discussed, right, on these conversations. And I have done several panels with people who represent tribal nations. And so if we think that many of the communities that we're talking about are disconnected, go to tribal lands and you will see a whole different story. And some of it is for a variety of reasons, with regards to rules. But, the statistics and the demographics, as a researcher, we should have every reason to care about our tribal lands, our original people that were here, and the fact that they're connected. What's being done? And Claude, I'll start with you, because I know the FCC has been proactive in the past with regards to connecting tribal lands. What's been the progress in actually bringing digital inclusion to those areas?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, Nicole. That's an area that has lagged and does continue to lag behind for a number of reasons. One of the ways that the FCC has tried to deal with the adoption side of the equation on tribal lands is to make additional subsidy money available for Tribal Lifeline. And that, the commissioner and I went out to visit Navajo Nation last fall, and we were able to see some of the fruits of that there, and talk to some of the people who were on tribal lands and who did not have running water, who did not have electricity, but they had a Lifeline phone, and they basically told us, like, without this, we really would be living back in the 1800s. So there is an effort on behalf of the FCC to address some of those problems. There are a lot of issues that are very technical, dealing with rights of way and property rights, and just a lot of the remoteness issues that rural areas face, that are compounded by the tribal issues. But this is something particularly that Commissioner Clyburn is committed to working on, and committed to trying to work to fix.
Yeah, and I would urge this community that is actually, tapped into this broadcast here, and tapped into this week, and tapped into the general areas. We must continue to talk about this conversation of how do we make sure that our friends that are on tribal lands are not disconnected from the internet. Because as we all have heard from every person that's on this panel, technology helps solve problems too, right? And they also bring opportunity. So it's a glass half full, glass half empty paradigm. And we should all try to brainstorm better ways to actually make sure we get stuff done. Jim, I wanted to go to you because there was a prior question as we start getting closer to time. What is blocking change for digital inclusion for those with disabilities? I mean, you've talked a little bit about, this separation and segmentation of the disability community from the mainstream when it comes to being good consumers. What else is blocking it? I mean, what's going on here that we're not seeing, like you said, the payoff of the social tax and the economic tax, and we're not servicing people with disabilities?
Well, we talk about a digital subdivide, which is not entirely a funny term, but the leading consumers, advanced consumers with disabilities, are zooming ahead and have zoomed ahead ever since whenever a new piece of technology came out. So, for example, Pacific Bell found that in sometime in the mid 80s, I don't remember the year, but the highest adoption of household fax machines was in the deaf community, which makes sense when you think about it. You can fax in a pizza order or something like that, right? So the people at the leading edge of the disability communities have always been there, adopting and even creating the technologies. It's the folks at the other end who are getting left out, and it is the convergence of a whole bunch of factors, not only their specific disability, but the fact that they're predominantly older, they're predominantly lower income, lower economic attainment, much higher minority populations, much higher rural and inner city. And those are already jeopardized. So you throw in the big question mark of, will this work for me? And that's where, that's where things fall down. But again, it's on the demand side. We don't have enough connections to those folks demonstrating, showing how this works and the benefit to you for shopping, for banking online, whatever it is that your disability is a barrier in participation. This online world can really substitute for that. We need to get a lot of talented, confident people out there, many of whom will be peers. So we don't need hire 100,000 digital evangelists for the disability community. It's really empowering the peer network and letting that grow and expand and permeate out there. And there are plenty of great models of doing it. We just need to scale them up and encourage them.
Yeah, and this actually leads into a question from the CTM Bay Area. Any exciting lessons, trends that any of you all have seen that could translate to other cities and programs? Like, what's out there that, just to sort of flip this conversation for a minute, that other places could actually adopt rather quickly?
I'll throw something out that continues on it. Sometimes it helps to go deep on one example, and I keep citing some of the work that the Housing Authority here in Austin has pioneered. And one of those was again a result of a partnership with the other groups working on unlocking the connection, and that is the Digital Ambassador Program. And Jim mentioned a peer network, and that's exactly what that builds on within a public housing community, is to have residents themselves really take leadership of the initiative and talk to their neighbors, bring neighbors to events, tell them why it's not so scary to go to that 101 class for the first time, and maybe there's something worth trying there. And if it's scary, then I'll come and sit with you. And so I think that's a model that the San Antonio Housing Authority and others are also continuing to put in place, because it's getting results.
Yeah. Anybody else? Roberto, Claude, Jim, any other examples for this viewer? Lessons, trends that we've seen that could translate into other cities or programs? I mean, I'll share one since I've actually did it. When I was at One Economy, we also did something called Digital Connectors that actually was a great model of starting to empower people within communities to be very much a part of the solution when it comes to digital inclusion. So we often bring in people who are outside of the communities, which also makes many people feel uncomfortable because they don't feel trustworthy. And it's also a great model, just as Prince was talking about with public housing, to think about ways to get seniors and young people and adults sort of engaged in this technology. I was on a panel last week, and I'll leave you with something that just stayed with me with regards to this viewer. It's not so much just digital inclusion. It's the fact that if people do not have access to technology, not just a device, but knowing how to use it, they can't even apply for a job today, right? They can't go into a McDonald's or a grocery store or other places and fill out that kiosk. Those transferable skills that people take for granted, all of us that are looking at this webcast now, there are people who are silenced out of that economy. And so again, it's interesting to find ways to engage people by thinking about what can local people do who can endorse the use of the technology and make it a lot simpler. And I'm going to conclude with this question that just came from a viewer around healthcare. I think this whole conversation is sort of centered around, why do we have to kick and scream to make this country realize that digital inclusion is part of the fabric of our social and economic outputs? If we have a president that tweets, darn it, everybody should be on Twitter, because if you're not, you're really not understanding the conversation firsthand. Is healthcare one of those areas, my friends, where we should be looking at technology as a driver to get more people online and get the attention of the administration to make this a priority? Go ahead, Roberto.
I totally agree. I think healthcare, telehealth, and telemedicine in particular, and telework, the gig economy, we're just seeing the beginning. And I believe that these are going to be the killer apps that will make broadband and hopefully make that urgent screaming just be heard. I feel sometimes like that poor first a telephone salesperson felt back 100 years ago, right? Here I come, Nicole, I sell you a telephone. You're like, yeah, who am I going to talk with, right? I think broadband started in its applications more on the entertainment side, but they have quickly moved way beyond that. And it's a matter of educating folks about that transition and its potential, because with artificial intelligence and all that's coming down the pipe, I do believe when your well-being and your job depend on a broadband connection, I think the message and the conversation will change. I hope they change before that, but they'll definitely change.
Claude,
Can I follow up on that?
you sure can.
Sorry to jump in there, because I thought what you were saying, Roberto, was really exactly in line with what I've experienced. You know, I've recently had some health challenges of my own, and because of that, I wound up on these patient portals. You know, and they've got the upside and the downside, and you know, they can be complicated and what have you. But in talking with people just in the waiting room about the patient portal, for some people, it was the first important thing that they ever did online. You know, they had an email address, but they never used it, or somebody gave them a Facebook account, but they never check it. But this patient portal is something that really meant something to them. So again, it reminds, you know, us of that. There's one killer app for each person, right? And healthcare can definitely be that. And it can also, again, be a family thing and a social thing, where being on a patient portal gives everybody information, and it lets people in the family come together to provide support for that patient. Very powerful. So I believe in healthcare as an attractor to the online world.
That's right. Claude?
Yeah, so thanks. You know, this has been a vertical that Commissioner Clyburn has been very interested in for a long time. Just the intersection between connectivity and health is huge from a couple of different perspectives. One, because of the additional value that it provides, you know, the healthcare community to have its patients connected. You know, leveraging that as part of the digital inclusion conversation is pretty huge. But then, you know, just from the care side of it as well. I mean, Jen was talking about the importance of patient portals. You know, we just, you know, heard a story this last week about you know, a low-income individual who would have had to take, you know, several buses to get to his you know, his mental health therapist, but instead his therapist was willing to conduct his sessions over Skype, and you know, he was able to save hours out of his life by leveraging technology in order to take advantage of the healthcare options that were available to him. So you know, I think that's an area that will continue to have tremendous potential in the future on a number of fronts. So yeah, let's focus on that.
Parisa, you want to say some closing remarks before we end this up?
I can't say it better than the prior three. Thank you for letting me join the panel.
Yeah, I mean, I would say with that call, Alina, who actually put that question out, I think you're so right. And I want to circle back just on a comment on that, because I've thought a lot about this, and this is some research we're doing over at Brookings. You know, if you look at programs like Lifeline, for example, a lot of those programs are designed to reduce the barrier of cost, but they're also designed to help people live more connected, healthier, wealthier lives, more vibrant lives by being connected. And telephone was the connection of the past, and broadband is now the connection of the future. I want to thank all of you, because I think we walk away right now not only celebrating National Digital Inclusion Week. Thank you to Austin Freenet for putting this together. Thank you for all the supporters across the country who are out there doing the daily work of this, through your technology centers, through your cities, through your community-based organizations, and some of you, honestly, through your individual efforts. We appreciate you. And we're going to keep bringing this effort to the top, because it's for those 13% of Americans that we've got to keep hammering the whatever that thing is. I'm not a good carpenter, but hammering at this issue until we get to a place that we need to get at. So with that in mind, I didn't mess this up. We got through this conversation. Let's do a virtual hand clap for everybody that was on the panel. Keep following this week. It's not over yet. It may be a week, but the journey is long and far, and we're going to get through this as a community together. Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of the day. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, all.
Thank you.
Thank you.